Well, Greg and I are absolutely delighted to have with us today our guest, John Antonik. For those of you who know John, you know his work is just fantastic. He is the Senior Director of Athletic Content, writes regularly, and you'll find it. We'll have that a link in the comments section so you can go to his work if you're not familiar. But Greg and I think there's nobody better in the country who focuses on the history of the institution the way that John focuses on WVU sports. And we were both taken by a number of recent articles, all the articles actually he writes. They're all worth reading. But now that we're at the end of the WVU season, there's a pivot point. We're looking forward. We're taping this a week after the national championship game, and sources are already coming out with the way too early rankings for the 24 season. But it's also a time to look backward, to look at what happened in history. And John did that with a recent article, and he focused on strength of schedule and looked at WVU football from a strength of schedule point of view. Some really interesting data, and always with John's work, you'll learn something, you'll learn a lot, and there are things that I didn't know. And I won't give you the title of the article because it gives it away. But John, talk to us about why you decided to take a focus on strength of schedule for WVU football, what you found and what surprised you.
Well, I was talking to Jed Drenning on one of the broadcasts, and we were just talking about different schedules through the years. And I mentioned I had done kind of a deep dive and just looked at every schedule that West Virginia played going back to really 1915. And the reason 1915 is that was when WVU really started to play more national teams and became more focused on football. So I went back and I researched them, and I've got mountains of material in my house from years of doing research, and looked at each team, each season. And obviously there's different ways that you can compare schedules. If you take, for instance, Neil Brown, he's played power conference schools, 11 power conference schools the last 3 years. That's tough. You can look at nationally ranked teams and the number of nationally ranked teams on your schedule. Dana Holgerson played the most in 2017. He played 6. Or you can look at winning percentage. Every schedule going back, there are power conference schools, there are local schools, FCS type schools, small schools. So I looked at winning percentage, and there was a run there in the 20s, the late 20s, when West Virginia was playing schedules against teams that were with winning percentages combined in the high 60s, and even one instance in 1929, 70%. Those teams won 70% of their games. Those were hard schedules. And then there have been some years, particularly in the years in the Southern Conference, as you know, you wrote the book, The Band of the Brothers, the late 60s, early 70s, when West Virginia was transitioning out of the Southern Conference into playing an Eastern Independent schedule, and they weren't playing very difficult schedules. Mm-hmm. So, and what I've found too through just years of doing this, talking to different people, researching whatnot, generally speaking, when West Virginia had manageable schedules, they had great seasons. And when they had difficult schedules, they struggled a little bit. There were very few instances when West Virginia played a really difficult schedule and performed well. I mean, I could give you one example right off the top of the bat is the 1988 season. That's considered the greatest season in school history. And I have it right here. West Virginia that year in 1988, they went undefeated, obviously. And in that season, West Virginia played 2-8-1 Bowling Green, 5-6 Cal Fullerton, which dropped football. Maryland was 5-6 that year. Pitt was 6-5. Virginia Tech 3-8. East Carolina 3-8. Boston College 3-8. Penn State, the only losing season Joe Paterno had was that year. They were 5-6. Cincinnati 3-8. Rutgers 5-6. Syracuse 10-2. That was a really good win. So there was a season where everything came together. A really good team playing a really manageable schedule, gets to the national championship.
Wow. What do you think, Greg?
And that's not to take anything away from the season. That's the schedule that they played. But that's kind of the context. When people look at seasons, they rarely remember, they look at bowl games, they look at things. They rarely remember all of the circumstances that go into it. All they remember is, did they win? Did they lose? What was the outcome? That's just the general mindset of but that's an example of having a manageable schedule and getting to the national championship game.
Wow.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it, but I'm guessing that our years in the Big East, when we had some of those really good seasons, and again, I haven't looked at schedules or anything, but I'm guessing that those years when we were in the Big East and had those great runs, probably the schedules weren't real tough then either, just based on the teams that are in the Big East. In the Big East.
Yeah, I mean, when Rich took the job in 2000, Miami was as good as anybody in the country.
Right.
If you compare the Big 12 to what the Big East was when Miami, Virginia Tech, Syracuse, Boston College, very, very comparable. I'm not sure, even in the years that Oklahoma had their run, they weren't as good as Miami was in the late 90s and early 2000s. I mean, that was the type of schedules that West Virginia was playing. Virginia Tech was excellent. They were every bit as good as, if you want to compare them, you could take Miami and compare that to Oklahoma, take Virginia Tech, compare it to Texas, pretty comparable. And then obviously those teams leave. There's an opportunity there, and Rich was able to take advantage of it. And he went out and recruited Pat White. He recruited Steve Slayton, Owen Schmidt, and get lightning in a bottle. Get the right, everything kind of works together, and they have that great run, one of the great runs in school history.
Yep.
Yeah, when you think about it, this is one of the values, I think, of John, at looking at anything through the lens of history, because we tend to focus only on the outcome. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what are the circumstances that may have contributed to it? And you and I have had a conversation about Pappy Lewis, and many people think that's really when West Virginia football got on the map nationally. Of course, they went to a big bowl game, Sugar Bowl, to play Georgia Tech. But the bottom line is that a lot of people criticize, as you mentioned in the article and also on this interview, criticize those schedules. I mean, a ton of undefeated seasons in the Southern Conference. But as I mentioned in the book, and obviously the Southern Conference in the 50s was not the Southern Conference it was in the 40s and the 30s, when you had the Southeastern Conference teams. They're now Southeastern Conference teams like Alabama were there in the 20s, left in the 30s, and then the Atlantic Coast Conference was established essentially the mid 1950s. And so, when Pappy was cruising through for the most part, the Southern Conference, it was just Virginia Tech and West Virginia left. And
Give you an example. When Lewis took the job in 1950, the Southern Conference still had Clemson in it, still had Maryland in it. It was considered a major conference. North Carolina was in it. They left in 1952. Those schools broke away, formed the ACC, and then the year that happens is the year West Virginia goes to the Sugar Bowl. The year 1953, look at this. They played Pitt. Pitt was down. And they were ranked when they beat Pitt, but Pitt ended the year 3-5-1. Pitt was playing incredibly hard schedules back then. They played Waynesburg. They played Washington and Lee. They played George Washington, VMI, beat a pretty good Penn State team that was 6-3 that year, beat Virginia Tech 5-5. They lose to South Carolina, which was good. And then they beat a really bad NC State team to get in the Sugar Bowl. I mean, it was the record of the teams that year were 49, 45-2, just barely 500. They get to the Sugar Bowl. And then of course, after that, there was some criticism. West Virginia had criticism because they were playing weak schedules. They were in the top 10. So Lewis says, okay, let's play tougher schedules. And they go to Illinois. They go to Wisconsin. They go to USC. And Art Lewis is scouting for the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1960.
Yeah, you pointed out in the article how painful, you didn't
Yeah,
use that word, I will, how painful that 59 season was.
yeah,
And it was obviously the end of the era.
yeah.
Nothing lasts forever. But if you look at that compared to, say, 55, 54, and of course the run with 3 straight wins over Penn State
Mhm.
uh, was a high. But yeah, history is a great teacher. And uh, as we were talking before the program, one of the reasons you want to look at history is, and perhaps you can talk about this a bit, is patterns. What
Mhm.
happens before tends to happen again.
It does. It does. And, you generally speaking, when you talk about the history of West Virginia, um, there are patterns. West Virginia, going all the way back to the 1920s, they would play weak schedules, build up, win games, get criticized, beef up the schedule, then struggle. You know, Rat Rogers, when he took over for Clarence Spears, he was playing some incredibly hard schedules. Spears started that, then left and went to Minnesota, and then ultimately Rogers was forced to resign after the 30 season. They bring in Greasy Neal. Greasy Neal took Washington Jefferson to the Rose Bowl, the famous scoreless tie against Cal. Of course, Greasy Neal is in the Hall of Fame. He's a pro football coached the Eagles and the Steagles when they were combined with the Steelers, and coached the Eagles to an NFL championship. He couldn't win here. He couldn't win against those schedules. And then they went through coach after coach. And the average life expectancy of a football coach until Lewis got here was 2.5 years.
Yeah.
And Art Lewis kind of stabilized it. He kind of hit it right because he was a great recruiter. And at the time in the state, the mining industry was at its peak. Your population in around 1950 was about 2 million. The chemical industry over in the Kanawha Valley and up and through the Ohio Valley, there were a lot of good players. And there were a lot of good players in West Virginia that were going to other schools. One year, when General Neyland coached at Tennessee, half the starting lineup came from West Virginia. George Casco was a great player at Tennessee. He was from Oak Hill. West Virginia was sending players all over the country. There were guys going to Michigan, Pitt, some of Pitt's great. Marshall Goldberg is one of the great players in Pitt history. He's from Elkins. Ibby Welch from Parkersburg was a great player for Pitt. These were all American type players. Kafko, I think, finished second in the Heisman Trophy balloting the year that he. So there were great players in West Virginia. Lewis was the first one coach to really tap into it and keep those guys home. I mean, you had in that year when he got Bruce Bosley and Fred Wyant and Sam Hubbard. Bosley wasn't even known. He was over in Greenbank. Nobody even knew about him. And the story goes is that when they were putting together the rosters for the North-South game, I think might have been the South. I don't know I think Bosley played for the South. One of the two teams was down a player, and Lewis said, "Listen, I know a player that you can get to fill that roster, but you got to protect me. I don't want any coaches tampering with this guy." And so he recommended that they go get Bruce Bosley. Of course, everybody saw him and go, "Oh my God, this guy's an Adonis. He's incredible." Those were the kinds of players that West Virginia was getting in the early 50s. And then the well kind of ran dry. After Wyatt played on a 2-win team at Weston, played both ways, was a defensive back and quarterback and ran the ball all the time. And Lewis said, "That's my perfect T quarterback." And he turned out to be perfect for what they were doing. And these were all West Virginia guys. That Sugar Bowl team, all those guys were from right around Morgantown. You got Joe Marconi was just right across the border in Fredericktown. He went to Maryland and then left after a week and came here and was a great player for West Virginia. Bobby Moss, of all those guys, was probably the most highly recruited of them all from Huntington. These were all good players, and Lewis tapped into that, and it really helped West Virginia. The well kind of ran dry moving into the 60s, and then, of course, Jim Carlin came in 1966 and kind of changed everything. I think Jim Carlin was the guy that really put West Virginia on the path to where we are today. He was the guy that was thinking big. He was the guy that was going around to the Kiwanis Club and the different places and speaking about Mountaineer football and the things that people needed to do here and how they needed to think to put this in a different trajectory. And I was, guys that I talked to that covered him always thought that the first brick in Mountaineer Field was laid when Jim Carlin got here, because he got people thinking differently.
Yeah, no question. Disappointed again this year that he didn't get voted into the College Hall of Fame. Yeah, I agree with you. And of course, the people I interact with all the time would agree with that too, because they played for him. But he did change the narrative, and he just went across the state. And I'm not sure he was a Pappy Lewis clone, but those personalities. Obviously Pappy Lewis was gregarious, and Jim Carlin was really more of a CEO type. But boy, got it done. Greg, your thoughts? This is to me, it's like going to a 3-credit seminar listening to John.
Yes, it is. And when you hear some of those names he throws out, it's amazing to hear those names and know. I mean, like when he mentioned Cafago. I mean, I live 5 minutes from Cafago Road right out here.
Right.
And of course, we've got Lonnie Warwick right here. And you think about all these folks in the past that were just, I mean, like he said, all-American NFL football players.
About the black players like Lionel Taylor.
Right.
Go on and on and on. Charlie Cowan, all these guys from down in the coal fields that, before integration. Just tremendous, terrific players. This state produced a lot of really good players. And, per capita, it doesn't compare to Ohio and Pennsylvania. But, you talk Randy Moss, one of the great players of one of the great natural talents of all time, West Virginia. I mean,
it's say per capita don't equal out, but when you look at the caliber,
right?
It's I don't know that there's anybody much better than what we've produced, because you got Hall of Famers everywhere.
Absolutely. Sure. And you know what? We're having a good run of offensive linemen right now. I mean, look at what's been produced here in the last 5 to 10 years, and West Virginia's benefited. They haven't gotten them all, but a lot of the ones that they've gotten have been really good, high level players. I remember, Bill Kurlavich would tell me that one of the things that Don Nealon did, one of the things that he was able to do was he had time. After he beat Florida in the Peach Bowl, and then they beat Oklahoma 9 months later, he had time to be able to do what he wanted to do, because he knew he couldn't recruit against Penn State and Pitt and get the elite linemen or whatnot, but he could develop them. And so he took players, and over a 5-year period, developed them into players as good as anybody. I remember Kurlav telling me he remembered Billy Legg. He said Billy Legg, when he came out of high school from Polka, was a good player, but we developed him. By the time he was done at the end of his career, he could play anywhere. And that's what Nealon did. And if you look at Nealon's career, it went in 5-year intervals. Yep. Beginning in 88, when he'd redshirted and had all those players. Then 93, right? He went back to the Sugar Bowl. And then 98, probably the most talented roster he ever had was that 98 team. Begin the year, they lose to Ohio State, and then lost a couple of other games along the way, weren't able to get the momentum like those other two teams did. But he always felt that talent-wise, he probably had more pro players on that 98 team, but it was because he was in this pattern of developing players. He was a great coach at motivating guys, and getting guys to believe they could do more than they could. And he had a lot of guys on his staff that were, number one, were loyal, and number two, were very, very good at identifying players. I always hear the story they would tell about Donnie Young finding Steve Newberry, playing basketball, saw him at a basketball game, touch the top of the backboard. So that's the kind of guy I want. Steve Newberry couldn't bench the bar, but he was just a natural athlete and came and became a terrific player. So many stories like that. And yes, West Virginia has always been able to be to do more with less. That's always been kind of our motto, regardless of what era you look at. We've always been a little bit different, or tried to be a little different. If you look at what Rich Rodriguez did during his time here, little bit different, the way they played offense, the way they played defense. Going over to basketball, John Beilein was a little bit different. I think you have to do that. You have to kind of get your niche. And, you take a school like Ohio State with all the resources that they have, okay? Well, they can play any way they want, but they're going to play the way everybody else plays because they have better players, right? So if your players line up and they're better than the team you're playing, well, then you better come up with a different way of doing things. And for the most part, we've had innovative, resourceful coaches here, and I think that's the way West Virginia's won. I think that's the way they're going to continue to win.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. And as you talk, and I know Greg feels the same way. If you're related to West Virginia in any way, you should be proud of that. It applies to individuals too. Who are you? And basically try to be the best person you can be. And sometimes in sports, we sometimes believe the gold standard, in college sports, you be like Ohio State or Texas or whatever. And you got to be the best you can be because the circumstances, it's uneven terrain. And so I think you're right. And the other thing it says is the people making the decision on who becomes a head coach, how critical that is to get a person who understands the circumstance,
right,
embraces it. And then this is the pattern again. Different athletic directors have made decisions that brought different coaches in, but they fit the pattern of being able to do what they needed to do given where they were. And to me, and I know Greg feels the same way, that's really critical. That is absolutely critical. And that's one of the things that history can teach you, and then be proud of that. Any final comments, Greg, questions before we bid John adieu?
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you, you think with Neil Brown, do you feel like that he's kind of evolved to the point to where he understands the importance of grabbing these West Virginia players? Because it seems like he's focused more than our past few coaches on in-state talent, and he's gotten quite a few really good players. And I think I don't know if that was his plan coming in or if it's just kind of evolved that way. But do you feel like Neil Brown's kind of got it figured out here?
I think he's got he's got a full understanding of the situation. And I think every place you go, it doesn't matter what school you're at. Everybody has strengths and everybody has challenges. Obviously you want to accentuate your strengths, minimize your challenges, and work around those. I mean, obviously our strength, we've got a rabid fan base. We've got, it's the entire state. The entire state supports West Virginia athletics. And that's a very, very positive, powerful thing to have behind you. And then, obviously where we are geographically, I think, historically, we've always been able to do well when we've gotten players within a reasonable drive of campus. Okay. I think Neil's approach is, 6 hours. I think that's what he's looking at. When Don Nehlen got the job, that was his approach. I remember him telling me the story about, Bo Schembeck was like, Don, why would you take this job? I mean, I'm looking at the schedule and you play Pitt at the time. Pitt was terrific. Penn State was who they were. They dominated the East. And then you had Maryland, which had Jerry Claiborne, which was very good. You had all of these other schools on there. And he's going, Don, I look at this and I see Oklahoma coming on. He said, you can't win here. And Nehlen said, well, Bo, I think I can, because he took out a map and he drew a circle around Morgantown. He said, I look around here and I see all these places, and I feel like I can get 25 good players a year within a reasonable drive of this campus. And that was his approach. And then he met a guy named Rick Perry, who was down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And he said, Don, there are a ton of West Virginians that now live in Florida. You need to get down here. And Nehlen said, I don't have the resources. I can't cover the whole state. We don't have the resources to be able to do it. He said, no, don't do that. Just focus on Broward and Dade County. There is enough people down here. And Florida State and Florida and Miami, they can't get all these guys. There are enough good players. You can come down here and get a few. And they did it with Andrew Johnson. And from Andrew Johnson, and then eventually they kept going and going and going. And eventually they got better players. So they were getting all of their linemen and all of their a lot of their bigger players around the local area, and they were getting their skill and their speed in Florida. And if you look at what Neil Brown has done, what the last few years, it's a similar strategy. He's kind of focused on that circle around the campus, and I think he's getting guys that are hungry. I think we do better when we got players that are hungry and want to prove themselves, as opposed to maybe guys that are looking for other reasons, whatever those reasons are. We've always seemed to do better doing that. And I think Neil now, after 5 years of being here and experiencing the things he's experienced, and I think he's got a real good understanding and knowledge of the unique situation we have here, our strengths and our weaknesses. And I think you're starting to see the fruits of the labor, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, I'll tell you, we said at the beginning that no one does it better than John Antonik. And boy, you just gave us a class in the history of WVU football that I think is really important. And actually, one of the reasons Greg and I wanted to do this now is that there's no better time than between now and spring football to get boned up on the history, because I think it helps us understand, brings a deeper and richer perspective to understanding where we are now, where we could go.
Right.
And so thank you so much for spending the time with us. And I hope we'll have you back in the future. You're just a gift, and we appreciate so much the work you do for the university and for the fans.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks. Very kind of you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.